You're live, Madam Chair.
And welcome back, folks. This is House Corrections and Institutions, Tuesday, January 31st, and we're continuing our work this afternoon. We are shifting gears a little bit. We're going to have a report on the proposal for a cash fund. We did initially put in place the preliminary part of a cash fund at the end of last session. And at the end of the session, there was about $8 to $9 million that was projected to be in there. And there were some parameters written around that would be used for construction planning dollars for our construction projects. And then one statement at the end which goes on and for any other needs. So that is interpreted to be pretty broad. We also had language, this is all done in the appropriations bill last year. There was also language, and there would be a report back into how does the structure of the cash fund come about? How does it operate and what is it to be used for? So that report was done by the Agency of Administration through the Department of Finance and Management, and also in consultation with Joint Fiscal Office. So we have with us today the Commissioner of the Department of Finance and Management, Adam Griscom, who is also a former member here and served on the Ways and Means Committee while he was here, and Finance and Management Budget Analysis, Nick Kramer. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Commissioner, if you could get started, and then we'll go from there. So welcome.
And thank you, Madam Chair. And actually, it's been delightful to be back in room. This is a great committee. The windows, it gets a little hot.
It's a little hot.
But it's nice to see the light. So yes, I'm Adam Gresham, Commissioner of Finance and Management, for the record. And
for the record, Nick Kramer, Budget Analyst, Finance and Management.
And we appreciate the audience. I mean, I think as the chair intimated, this was an important initiative for the government. This is something we're all in on this. And so we're really glad you're giving us a chance to explain and I know the chair provided some context, but I just wanted to mention that this was originally proposed in last year's governor's recommended budget. It was a 6.525 million amount that we proposed to transfer in section D101. We created the fund again in governor's recommend in an E section 107.1. And in that fund language that we put in the governor's recommend, we noted the 4% transfer methodology that we will address today. So, this was all in the recommended budget. The legislature, took that up, and I think, spent a fair amount of time on that. And the result was Act 185, which in section C102 transferred actually $25 million into the fund. And in E106.1 of Act 185 created the fund. And in E106.2 asked for the report that you have on your desk. So that's kind of why we're all here. The report that you have on your desks or on your machines, the substantial amount of work was done by Nick Kramer, who's one of our budget analysts. And I just thought it would be a great idea if the person who did the work sat in front of you. But it was a collaborative effort. He worked with our team at Finance and Management. In addition, he spent quite a bit of time speaking with the folks at Joint Fiscal Office as well as the Treasurer's Office. So this really kind of has been a collaboration. So, Chair, with your permission.
That'd be great. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Commissioner. I think the Commissioner is being kind with his words, but it bears underscoring that really all I've done is pick up the threads of work that other people have done before me, namely my predecessor, Mike Middleman, who some members of the committee will remember from prior year testimony, And I think the report that's before you, again, as the commissioner alluded to, really owes a lot to the contributions of the treasurer's office over the last couple of years. Former Treasurer Pierce being an integral thought partner to the concept, having stood up a cash fund, similar kind of concept in a large municipality in a prior role in Connecticut. And then obviously Commissioner Piechek's ongoing support has been important. And just since we're giving shout outs, I really want to thank Joint Fiscal and the flexibility of the committee in working with a deadline. I know there was a little bit of a pushback, but that really gave us a chance, I think, to have dialogue and work through some of the finer points. So my hope is that the report in front of you at least converges towards consensus, perhaps more so than if we hadn't had that chance. So that being said, I guess I'll dive right into it. I don't want to be one of those people who comes in and just reads the report. I assume everybody's had a chance to familiarize themselves maybe a little bit. Okay, then maybe I will.
Ground zero. This is a brand new committee.
Well,
So they weren't privy to all the conversations last year. So we really have to start at ground level.
okay. Well then, barring a word by word read through, I will do my best to be very granular and really speak from the ground up about this. So as the commissioner said, last year, the administration jointly with the Treasurer's Office proposed this idea of capital expenditure, which in essence is a really pretty simple concept. It's, straight out of Home Economics 101. If you can save your pennies ahead of time to pay for certain costs, instead of putting it on your credit card, you stand to save pretty substantially on interest payments over time. And furthermore, if you make a habit of this, potentially down the line, the credit card company gives you a better deal. That's another component. In this case, the agent in question being the state of Vermont, the credit card being our general obligation bond issuances, and the universe of expenditures in question being our capital budgets, which primarily have been funded through the issuance of general obligation debt. Chair Emmons will, of course, remember counterexamples to this throughout, I'm sure, her tenure. There have been years where on sort of a one-off basis, when surplus is available, the state chooses not to bond. But in any sort of systemic ongoing way, I think it's fair to say, especially in recent history, primarily the capital budget is reliant on bonding. So the idea behind the cash fund is, given that reality, and given an ongoing effort on the part of the Treasurer's Office, the administration, this body, and others to lower Vermont's bond debt issuance over time. And there are a number of really valid reasons for that, I think, having to do with ratings from the credit rating agencies, the sustainability of debt service payments. I think it's important to situate this report in a larger context that the state has been trying to lower bonding for a long time, by which I mean the last decade at least. And so the idea here is, how do we propose a construct that doesn't sacrifice the necessary investments in our capital projects, which I think everybody in this room is attuned to. The long list of projects that need doing, as we try to simultaneously lower the amount of bonding that the state is doing, how do we continue to invest in needed capital projects and build some sort of auxiliary funding mechanism? So at a high altitude, what this fund is proposing to do is, within the bucket of capital budgeting, not decrease or increase the size of that bucket necessarily, but in a systematic way over time, transfer the percentage of those appropriations from fully borrowed to an increasing percentage that is paid for upfront. And then the idea being that the more this happens, this can create kind of a virtuous cycle where the more cash fund is used, presumably if that offsets general obligation borrowing, then there are some interest savings incurred. If those funnel back into the cash fund, then there's more cash fund to offset more borrowing, et cetera. And so over time, this can grow to a pretty substantial piece of the capital budget. So that's at a very high altitude, of course, the idea. I think in the conversations I've been privy to, there's not a lot of objection, right, to that level. That's a good idea. Everybody knows to not charge your credit card if you can. I think where the rubber hits the road, and this committee will be no stranger to the kind of devil in the details feature to proposals like this is, okay, how do we fund it? So there was a proposal last year that the administration came forward with. There was a menu of options. After vigorous debate and some push and pull between the two chambers and the various committees of jurisdiction, as the commissioner said, there was $25 million made as a one-time appropriation into the fund in FY23 as kind of a seed base fund balance. And then there was that $20 million that was appropriated to the treasurer's office for the early redemption of certain callable bonds. And I believe the idea there being that the savings from those early redemptions could trickle back into the fund and provide a kind of medium-term funding stream. So I think sitting with that $20 million is maybe a good place to start, because I think even that well exemplifies some of the challenges inherent in this kind of proposal. So right now, the treasurer's office has $20 million from which they can call bonds early. But there's a whole host of questions about, okay, so do you, at any given time, the state of Vermont has any number of callable bonds? Do you call the ones with the highest current interest rate? Do you call the number of the bonds that have the longest time to go until maturity, the end of their amortization period? Some bonds mature tomorrow, some bonds mature in 10 years. Depending on your goals and when you want to realize those savings, those are sort of non-trivial decisions to make, and perhaps pseudo-political, right? It becomes this kind of this constant game of trying to figure out, when should you make redemptions? If you think about this from the perspective of new capital expenditure cash fund usage, so let's say, pick a number, we use 8.35 million of capital expenditure cash fund in FY24, how should this body, the state, realize those savings over time? The way the statutory language is currently worded, it says savings from early redemption, or I'm not going to quote it perfectly, but basically cash fund, the savings incurred from cash fund use should trickle back into the fund. So taking those $8.3 million, if we don't issue those in bond issuance this year, do you calculate hypothetically the full debt service schedule for if we had issued those $8.3 million and then realize all those savings up front? Do you create a hypothetical debt service schedule over the full course of 20 years, as we would typically do, and then every year book some amount of those, what you would have paid in interest? There's challenges and advantages to doing it both ways. If you do this every single year for every piece of cash fund used, you can see how those hypothetical debt service schedules would aggregate. In 20 years, whoever's charged with this task would have to be looking at 20 different hypothetical debt service schedules, which in and of themselves are problematic, because which do you use the prevailing interest rate at the time of GovRec preparation? Do you use the prevailing interest rate at the time of capital bill passage? Or do you try to sync these up to actual bond issuances, which, as this committee knows, don't necessarily align with the annual appropriations process?
So I think we're losing the committee here. So the goal is, the way we had initially thought of funding the cash fund was there were some bonds out there that were called callable, CALLEABLE. And the state treasurer was saying, let's pay off those bonds that we own. So we put aside $20 million to pay off those bonds. Pay off the bonds early. Some of them you can do that and some you can't. So the thinking was that if you pay off $20 million of bonds that you can, it's going to save you money on your debt service. On that line item, in the appropriations bill. You may not get a big savings that first year. I think we were calculating maybe 600,000 the first year. You put that money into a cash fund. And then the next year, I think it calculated $2 million that you'd end up saving on paying interest on those bonds. So you put that into the cash fund, and then you draw that money from the cash fund to our projects in the capital bill, which at the time was just for the planning piece. That was the concept. So people followed that. So then the pushback on the cash fund was, why go through that whole logistics thing? Why not just say you're going to put cash to the projects? Why go through that logistics? That was the pushback. So that's the real simple piece to how you fund a cash fund. That was how it got the planning. That was the proposal to get it started. Then the next piece of that proposal was you take a certain percentage of the general fund dollars that you can put aside, but you also have to look at the amount that your debt service is decreasing because you're not bonding. So say we've got $76 million in debt service right now for all the bonds that we have established so far, all the previous capital bills. Then if you bond less in the next 2 years, which is the proposal, you're going to pay less interest because you're not bonding as much. So what the plan then was that the Appropriations Committee would move that amount of interest that was saved because we're bonding less, move that amount into the cash fund. So then the question also came back, why not just ask for general fund dollars? Why go through that convoluted formula? John?
You made two different scenarios for money coming in, so it'd be coming from two different directions?
One was the seed to get it started, which was paying off that 20 million callable bonds. And the ongoing funding was as...
That 4%.
Yeah, that 4%. And then the decrease in the amount that you're bonding. So you're paying...
Right.
You're not paying that interest, but appropriations would have to move those dollars over into the cash fund instead of paying the interest. That was the concept, the broad concept. Connor. Did you have any hand up too, Chip?
I did, yeah.
Chip and then Connor.
So,
Chip first.
if, would this all have happened if we didn't have a surplus? Is this relying on the fact that we
Nope.
had surplus money? No, okay.
Nope.
Okay.
Because
This
if
would
there,
have come from general fund
if the
anyway.
town,
Yeah,
if the budget is in deficit, you're still putting pressure of that 4% of your general fund to go into the cash fund,
Okay,
which means you're not going to get it.
right, okay.
In reality, how the building operates, if we're in a deficit situation with our budget, our general fund, thinking is there's no way that they're going to transfer money into a cash fund.
Right, right, okay.
That's the
kind of where I was
politics
going.
of it.
Yeah, okay, yep.
Okay? Connor?
I think you partially answered my question there. I'm still at a Fisher Price level on this. This is a very helpful conversation.
So am I.
I guess I'm just kind of hung up on like 4% a static number. The general fund is pretty turbulent. Do we have guardrails, if it's an exceptional
That's why
situation, sort of
we
what the
had-
chair is saying?
That's why we wanted a report back.
Well, I think he was going to explain how he got to 4%. It's not an arbitrary number. It lines up historically with about what we paid in debt service. So that's how we came to the number. So the idea is if we put about 4% of the fund, of the general fund, into debt service, historically, why don't we keep that 4%? But as we reduce our borrowing, our debt service is going to go down. And so there'll be a delta between what our debt service is and 4%, and we keep that for the cash flow, which slowly builds. So,
But slowly your debt service is going down, which in reality, you're going to be putting less and less money in because your debt service is going down. So your interest is not going to be as high as if your debt service was higher. So in reality, you're going to be putting less and less in.
And correct me if I'm wrong, the advantage of keeping it in a cash fund as opposed to using the general fund would be that it's segregated.
Well, so,
In other words, it's not sitting in that pot, that big pot. Is that a reasonable assumption or not?
well,
Somewhat segregated.
yes, I mean, it's good to have it segregated, but we also, I mean, and I think, Nick was gonna say this later, I mean, we're trying to work within this building, okay? So if we just took all what normally would be capital expenditures and paid up front and threw it over the appropriations committee, that kind of changes the way that money is allocated. Capital expenditures have always been determined in this committee, so we thought we were trying to work anyway with the way the building works. I mean, you guys may decide that that's not appropriate, but we were trying to work within the building. So, and I think there's good reason to have capital expenditures separated from what are typical appropriations.
So if you have a separate cash fund, then who has control of those projects? Because the projects come through this committee, but we can't appropriate that money for those projects. It is the appropriations committee that appropriates the money for that project, regardless if there's a separate cash fund or not. We can say to appropriations committee, for this $3 million planning, or for this $3 million project, we're gonna use $1 million, needs $1 million for planning, we're gonna use that from the cash fund. The approps can say, well, we're not gonna appropriate that $1 million. They can say that.
But you can appropriate from this committee.
Not from this committee, we can't we can list the projects, but if they're being funded by general fund, we don't have the authority to appropriate.
They're being funded by the capital expenditure cash fund, though, I think.
It's general fund dollars in there. It's general fund dollars in there.
I think, Madam Chair, if I could, and apologies, yes, some of this I was hoping to get to deeper into the report, but the way the transfer construct and the statutory language changes we're proposing are structured, we would have it as an automatic 4% calculation based on the last prior fiscal year's, 4% of the last prior fiscal year's total general fund appropriations. That's an intentional choice because that number is, at the time of budget preparation, totally fixed, closed. The last completed fiscal year during 2024 is 2022, so there's no debate about that number. If this proposal is adopted statutorily, automatically as part of the operating budget, that amount will be transferred into the cash fund. I obviously can't speak to your point about the actual appropriations being made in the big bill, but I think it's the administration's hope that this being codified in statute, and I know members of this committee have raised concerns about notwithstanding language. There are ways of getting around things, sure. I think our hope is that this being codified in statute, needing notwithstanding language, would constitute enough of a barrier that it would be fairly difficult for a single appropriations committee, should this be adopted, to decide, oh, this year we're going to scoop $10 million out of the cash fund. That automatically that calculation, which is based on the prior completed fiscal year, is set in stone as part of the GovRec operating budget. We would intend to continue to propose that transfer, and then I guess the same norms that govern the fact that this body has never exceeded the CDAC recommendation in its existence might play. Or this is similar in some ways to the general fund and transportation fund stabilization reserves, which to my knowledge are also not periodically dipped into for, say, committee of jurisdiction projects on sort of ad hoc basis. So I think what we were really hoping to institutionalize here, both by codifying in statute and proposing this very sort of mathematical formula transfer, is that this is something that just happens automatically. As the commissioner alluded to, we've been spending about 4% of our, and by we, I should clarify, I mean the state of Vermont, the legislature, and importantly, the appropriations committees have been spending about 4% of the overall general fund appropriations on debt service. If this report, if this body chooses to completely ignore this report and discard the idea of a cash fund completely, over the next 10 or 20 years, I mean, it depends obviously on a number of factors, but that debt service level will continue to stay between 3.5 and 4%. If the uses that we're proposing for cash fund here are rolled into general obligation borrowing, that number is going to hover between 3.5 and 4% anyways. The difference, of course, being under a cash fund scenario, over the course of that time, there's about $150 million of interest savings that the state incurs.
Over what period of time? A 20-year
Over a
period?
20-year period. So it's about $7.5 million a year.
Questions? Confusion? Thoughts?
I mean, admittedly, confusing structure, but we think it's kind of elegant, actually.
Kind of.
Kind of elegant,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah, that's our thought. I'm trying to get there. To elegant.
So the politics in this building, if people know that there's a pot of money out there, they go get it.
Almost as if you call it a cash fund, it says rob me.
And what we're already starting to see in this governor's budget proposal with FY '24 and '25 is a pretty broad interpretation of the cash fund. Because when it was presented here last year, and it was also presented this year, that it was to be used for planning purposes. And we're starting to see that it's being used for construction, site acquisition and construction, which was not the intent. The intent was it would be used for planning for our projects. So already there's creep.
So I believe, Madam Chair, that I'm not by any means the subject matter expert on this. I believe the technical definition of eligibility for cash fund use has to do with the kind of asset shelf life of the project in question. And I think there's a 10-year cutoff. So anything that has a, I won't get the word right, but depreciation schedule or sort of asset life of less than 10 years, which encompasses planning and other sort of prospective projects. I think all of that is eligible for cash fund use, at least according to what I've seen of the original proposal. So to the degree that there may have been some creep, I'd be interested to see whether that's, maybe construction projects that have a shorter time frame. Obviously, I can't.
Not when you buy land. Not when you buy land for a building. You're gonna own it more than 10 years, I would hope.
What's the downside of creep?
So you don't do it. So you don't do it. So in your report, did you go through and explain the funding mechanism, and did you also go into what the guardrails would be for the?
I did, yeah, and if it'd be helpful, Madam Chair, I'm happy to speak to this. So I think as has kind of come up already, the basic funding mechanism is that every year annually, there will be calculated this benchmark, which is 4% of the last prior fiscal year, last completed fiscal year's general fund appropriations. From that benchmark should be subtracted, I'm on, for anybody that wants to follow along, this is on page 2. So from that total of the last 4% of the last completed fiscal year's general fund appropriations, be subtracted the estimate for the current budget year's general fund obligations. That is a number that is calculated every year anyways. The Treasurer's Office, in consultation with the Department of Finance and Management, present that number. That's what informs the B1000 section of the big bill. That's just your current general fund, to some small degree transportation fund, but that's beyond the scope of this report. Transportation infrastructure fund. That number be subtracted from that benchmark, and any difference in those two numbers be automatically transferred as part of the D section of the operating budget. to the cash fund.
So we have a whiteboard. Can you put down some of those figures on the whiteboard so
The
people can see?
markers are in the first drawer on the bottom there.
So 4% of the last,
If it'd be helpful, Madam Chair, can I give it in terms of FY '24 to give sort of concrete? So this year, for instance, we're in FY, taking me back to my high school algebra teaching days. We're in FY '24, and we are considering the cash fund transfer. So you take 4% of the last completed fiscal year. In this case, that's FY '22. The books are completely closed. There's no
4% of general fund. It's not the whole budget.
So
It's only the general fund
total
piece.
general fund appropriations.
So how much is the general fund appropriations?
So if you
FY
look
_22.
on page 2, this is down below the bolded section. The total FY '22 general fund appropriations is $2,333,376,886. So that number, you take 4% of that number and get 93,335. 75. And then from that, you subtract this year's general fund debt service estimate, which is 75. So this is the FY '24 debt service estimate.
And that's what is in the appropriations bill that was proposed by the governor for this next fiscal year. There's a line item, debt service, which is 75.3 million plus.
Exactly. So you subtract, let's call this B, call this A, to A minus B, and in this case, you get 17.957082. So almost $18 million. I think it's worth noting here that this is a slightly, maybe sort of anomalously high figure. FY '22 general fund appropriations were swollen by the gifts from our
Pandemic.
friends in Washington, all of the federal stuff. So in the upcoming years, and I think Representative Emmons and others have pointed out, we may not continue on a linear trajectory. And I think that's worth highlighting that in these, so on the next page, baked into our assumptions of general fund growth, we've chosen an annual growth figure of 2.25%, which the astute reader may notice. Elsewhere in the report, it says, well, the actual general fund growth experience over the last 10 years was closer to 4%. So why 2.25%? Well, I think it's a valid question, but our feeling is, given, if you listen to the state economists and this current time of economic uncertainty that we're entering, deflation of federal stimulus, it may very well be, certainly in the next couple of years, if you look at the e-board forecasts, I think the average from FY '23 to FY '28 general fund growth is like 1.8, so it's not 4%. And over the course of the time period contemplated in this report, I think it's safe to say maybe we do better, but we wanted to be extra conservative on the general fund growth assumption, in part to help mitigate some of the concerns that I think Chair Emmons and others have raised. Well, what about those bad years, right? What if B is in fact larger than A? Does the cash fund then owe the general fund money? And the short answer is no. And we've included language you can see in the statutory suggested language amendments that very clearly specifies that floor, I guess it would be, that says if in the eventuality that there's basically that there would be a negative transfer, no transfer is made. And the thinking there, and part of why we've proposed a use schedule that does not eat all of your available fund balance in a given year, but instead very gradually works through that existing 25 million appropriation, which was made last year. One of the thinking behind that is so that if you do have a bad year and there's no transfer made to the cash fund, then there's this opportunity to draw from the existing fund balance and sustain use. And then the idea being that bad times don't last forever, and eventually the transfer would kick back up and there would be incoming. So do folks have any questions on
There is a
this?
question here, Wayne.
Not on the numbers, but is the underlying goal of this to provide some stability for capital projects?
No.
Yeah, I think it'd be fair to say that's perhaps a likely side effect.
The other side of this is the debt affordability committee could say, well, there's 17 million that's gonna go into the cash fund. We can cut our bonding by 17 million. So in essence, the capital budget is, the amount really may not be changed. We just got cut this year from 62 million down to 54. And it was saying, hey, there's the cash fund.
So this is simple math. I mean, we have the ability to save some dollars by using state dollars to capture that. But then in terms of kinds of projects that the capital bill needs to work on, longer term projects, the question then is, we were dealing with having the money, we also are dealing with the politics of do we get the money? And so those are two, the second one is that the problem that I see is the major problem. The money problem is simple math.
Well, we have almost, between our two budget cycles, we got 99 million in cash in our $203 million capital budget of 2 years. We've got 99 million. Are we gonna get all of that 99 million?
So in terms of planning, so that issue, that affects planning. We go through all this process. We're deciding what projects we're gonna have and whether or not we can fund them. And all of a sudden, somebody appropriations pulls the rug out from underneath us and those projects don't go. Is that considered?
Dan, can you pull that shade close a little bit? It's starting to get.
If I might, Madam Chair, can I respond to that piece? So admittedly, this year is my first rodeo with much of this. I was privy to the CDAC conversations and attended those meetings. And my impression, and I of course hear the sentiment in the room that I think Chair Emmons said it last week, lo and behold, there was a contemplated cash fund use and the debt authorization recommendation dropped. My impression was that those conversations were quite a bit more complex and nuanced than just that, and that it was by certain parties made pretty explicitly clear the lowering of the debt authorization was in fact driven by a host of factors other than the cash fund. The fact that we are sitting on $195 million of authorized but unissued debt, that the state has had difficulty getting projects out the door due to a variety of workforce issues and other sort of larger macroeconomic trends. So I totally, of course, hear the sentiment. I think it may be slightly more complicated than saying, oh, the cash fund exists and therefore the recommendation will be lowered.
And I agree with that. It was more complicated, but the cash fund played a big part in this. And also they only wanted to recommend a 1-year capital budget. They were telling the administration what to do. And by statute, we had that it was a 2-year capital budget, but they were saying, no, we may just do 1 year. It's like, wait a minute here. You're going up against statutes and you're telling the executive branch what to do and putting their budget together. So there was a lot of confusion going on back in September and October, the debt affordability.
I think, just to insert one last comment here, I mean, I think as I stated, as we've stated, part of the intent here to Representative Larash's point is to provide in an environment in which the state continually seeks to lower the amount of bonding available. How are we creating an alternative mechanism that, yes, may have slightly narrower definitions of what it can fund? I don't think this is envisioned to completely eclipse bonding by any stretch, but to the degree that maybe there is some healthy creep or some that the fund should be. I think the administration views it as a success if this is used to successfully augment and offset capital borrowing, whatever projects there's made.
I would also make one final contextual comment, and that is that, so in this year's budget, as the chair said, there's a fair amount of money that's coming over into the capital expenditure cash fund. In addition to the 17.9 million, there's $62 million. In what I would say in a more normal world, that would never happen. We just don't have $62 million sitting around on our bottom line that we can ship off. But we have a very large general fund surplus this year, and we're doing everything we can to put that money to work to save ourselves money in the times that it's not going to be that big. So I think the 62 million coming over is a bit unusual. I'd like to think we'll always have that amount of money sitting on our bottom lines, but what we're trying to do is put it to work to save us money somewhere down the pike. So some of this will provide resources for projects that we probably, if not definitely, will do in the future years that we can do now.
So let me just put this on the table for folks in terms of the world that we're existing right now with our general fund budget adjustment. Our colleagues in appropriation have added an additional 86 million to the governor's proposed budget adjustment coming out of the general fund surplus. We've already done that. Doesn't mean it's going to pass the Senate. Doesn't mean, we don't know where that figure is going to end, but they've already grabbed 86 million of the FY22 surplus. So you tell me that's not going to put pressure on our 62 million in our capital budget. And we don't know how that's going to play out over in the other body. We don't even know if it'll pass the floor. Probably will. We don't know how that's going to play out in the other body in the negotiations with the administration once the conference committee begins and where that amount lands. In the meantime, we've got to put a capital budget together. So I'm just laying that out for the committee.
Madam Chair, I think that was one reason we wanted to be really intentional about disaggregating the two kinds of capital expenditure transfer. There's this statutorily codified mechanism, which in our wildest dreams would become a sacrosanct thing that happens every year.
And that's one of your columns. That's one of the columns in the spreadsheet.
Right.
And then there are the one-time appropriations, which actually don't really factor into this report, other than I think they're mentioned somewhere that due to the extraordinary surplus we've had, where we are proposing that the cash fund be used as a mechanism to fund certain things. But I think this concept is divorceable from, to your point about other committees looking at one-time surplus and making, we're no strangers to the dynamics.
You're right in that we have a big pot of 200 plus $250 million in surplus. That's out of the norm. That's not normal. What is more normal is very, very small surpluses or deficits. And when we get into that deficit is where that 4% is going to be under pressure. Or even if the general fund is only increasing at 1%, you're already cutting it by 3% because the 4% commitment. So over time, that's going to impact our colleagues in Appropriations Committee and the administration, regardless of who's in the front office on the 5th floor, could say, wait a minute, we've got this cash fund here. Why we can use that. We'll put it in notwithstanding. The administration can propose that.
I think having this structure there.
But the structure we need to talk about. We need to talk about the guidelines and the guardrails for that structure, because we're not even clear on that. Because some of the cash fund is being used for site acquisition and some of it's being used for construction. And we were told it's for planning. And you even mentioned it's for 10 years. What's worth 10 years? Well, when you buy land or you construct a building, you're going to have it for longer than 10 years. So even that doesn't substantiate the governor's proposal here.
This committee can use that money, frankly, for whatever they believe is best use. Should be this committee's purview. our interest is putting money in there so you can use it to offset what would be normally borrowed. Whether that's for construction costs, whether that's for design costs, whether that's for land acquisition. To the average Vermonter who has to come up with these debt service payments, I'm not sure it matters. You know, so yeah, we'd be open to discussing what would be, you know, more amenable to this committee. But our goal is to provide money so that borrowing can be offset with money up front. That's basically how that money is spent. You know, I think this committee and the Senate Institution Committee will have a lot to say about that. I would just again emphasize that this construct, to Nick's point, I mean, this is what we're after. The $62 million was an extraordinary event that I support. In fact, I was the ones that suggested, why don't we send more money to the capital expenditure cash fund to reduce future borrowing? But that's unusual. That's not going to happen in a regular, normal world. But the 4% we hope will happen. And to your point, Madam Chair, I mean, I've been in this building a little bit too, and I'm quite certain that there are ways to find funding. I just got over explaining to the Appropriations Committee our notwithstanding language on the property transfer tax. Yeah, I'm well aware of what we do. But I think having the structure there to force the conversation is probably better than not having the structure. Anyway.
Wayne?
I don't think we're arguing that we wouldn't like to have the money, especially for the flexibility, because I can see if we could move things within each of our line items so that we could leverage the bonded money and minimize our costs, then we're going to want to do that. It would be a nice thing to be able to do. It's just a matter of, we have a stable system that's not going to get yanked out from under us. I think that's our real concern.
So Nick, you put down some further figures there. Of course,
By the way, he is really good at writing on the board.
FY25, you're saying we get 5.8.
So I just wanted to contextualize, Madam Chair, to my earlier comment that this is a somewhat unusual size transfer. And this is on page 3, I believe, of the report in the table. If folks are interested in the exact numbers. But so in FY25, according to our current debt service projections, the transfer would drop significantly to 5.8 million, thereabouts. And then in FY26, 14, and then 13, and then 14, et cetera. So you can see a lot depends on, obviously, the general fund, as has been pointed out several times, how that does. We are expecting a smaller general fund in FY24, so that will impact down the line, 2 years down the line. But yeah, this was just really meant to contextualize that this 17.9 million is kind of an outlier. So, I think just responding, kind of hearing the recurring concern about jurisdiction and some of the politics and issues in this building, I think from our perspective, from my humble perspective as somebody who sat with these numbers for a long time, the thing that has been most compelling, I think, is what I said at the outset, that if this doesn't happen and the proposed uses that are in column pink here on the third page, if those just are rolled into your general obligation bond issuance, the end result for the Appropriations Committee say, and the legislature in general, is that we will be continuing to pay around 4%. It won't be exactly 4%, but depending on the year, kind of bounce between 3.5 and 4%. So I think to the degree that that's a helpful talking point in this discussion, it's like, well, look, one way or the other, if presuming we want to have the same amount of capital investments, either partially through cash fund or entirely through borrowing, which may be a more stable outcome for this committee, but ultimately, over the course of 20 years, costs $150 million more in interest. if consensus could be reached on, hey, this is more or less where we're going to be anyways, why not codify it and kind of make this a simple calculation that happens every year? And I completely hear the reservations. I think we share an appreciation for the nuances of how things work here. But I think our hope is that the simplicity of this mathematical calculation, and if this proposal can get across the finish line this year, then moving forward, it's a pretty simple exercise to say, you have this number, you subtract this goes over to the capital committees of jurisdiction. They decide on the uses because this is within the capital budgeting process. And it's predictable. I mean, it's possible if this proposal was disregarded and the either the interest rates go way up for bond issuance, or more CDAC reverses the trend and more borrowing is proposed, it is possible we could get back to scenarios where we're paying more than 4%. I can't speak immediately to the numbers without running calculations. But I think that's just helpful context to know that we're probably somewhere around here anyways, regardless of what happens.
Questions? Comments? Chris?
With the alternative, this is just getting the sense, generally speaking, that this is sort of a mechanism, I think in the words of the report, to codify, as you said, just a regular stream of money to this, for this purpose. Would the alternative be that if there's not a mechanism or structure that, the governor could continue to recommend year to year that this happen. The legislature could agree on it, but it's not structured so much so it's going to kind of be forgotten. Is that the alternative?
Yeah, I think Representative Chair Hammond's concerns about in times of shortfall or deficit, I think that is an alternative. It seems to me that's a scenario in which it's a lot easier for other committees of jurisdiction and appropriations committees to say, okay, well, the governor is recommending this year X amount, but really we think it should be X minus Y. We should lower it or we should raise it. And I think the short answer to your question is yes, but I think it's part of why we feel fairly strongly that this be codified is to raise that barrier, to provide some stability to services.
Can I ask a follow-up? It's my understanding there's some interest being generated, but that is not primarily where the funding is coming from. It's just primarily coming from this annual allocation. And it looks, and the balance after increasing for a few years steadily goes down. Correct?
Right. So those interest calculations are primarily driven by the fund balance, far right column, which you can see is under the proposed use schedule, slowly decreasing. I think interest at 2% is not likely to be a much larger fund balance is not likely to be a significant funding source for the fund.
Thank you.
So I know the committee is starting to wind down, so I'd like to go to your number 3, proposed statutory amendments.
It would be helpful, Madam Chair, if I just walk quickly through it. Yeah, so this was the last piece of section 106.2, A3, which requested we submit any proposed statutory amendments. So the main pieces, I think it's maybe easier to look directly at the language than my summary. There's really two major pieces that were, or three, I would say, three major statutory changes we're recommending.
You're on page 6.
I'm on page 6, yes. So the first is in 1001B, B1A. It's the big block of text that's underlined that starts annually the state's appropriations. So that language just codifies exactly this mechanism that's on the whiteboard, saying that every year there should be a net transfer to the cash fund The amount is equal to 4% of the last completed fiscal year's general fund appropriations less the amount, et cetera, et cetera. And then I would draw everybody's attention to the last sentence. If the amount of general fund backed general obligation debt service exceeds 4% of the last completed fiscal year's general fund appropriations, no transfer shall be made in the budget year. So that's very clearly, we hope, identifying the situation in which there's a significant drop in general fund or increase in debt service, and making sure that money doesn't flow in the other direction. So that's one change. I'm happy to take any questions maybe on that. Okay. So then the next one is in subsection C, the use of funds, and this is a seemingly little change, but I think actually with some pretty relevant implications to this committee. The way the statute reads currently says, skipping to the second sentence, plans for use shall be submitted as part of the operating budget adjustment or operating budget process. We're recommending that be changed to say capital budget adjustment or capital budget process. And that's just to bring statute in line with the governor's current practice of proposing cash fund uses as part of the capital bill and come to this committee. All have been reviewing those in the last several weeks. We just believe strongly, since it's a capital expenditure cash fund, that it should fall within the purview of capital budget process. So that's that change. Are there any questions on that? And then the very last one, I guess I should highlight, I think there's so in subsection 3, there's a cross out of the word early redemption of general obligation bonds and then an insertion of and of their state tax paid debt. The treasurer's office might be better equipped to speak to that one. That was a technical suggestion from them. I think it just has to do with the fact that as worded, that language may be overly prescriptive in terms of what kinds of bonds can be redeemed. But again, I can't speak with final authority on their intent. I believe that was primarily a technical correction. So the last substantive one is, you can see the full strikeout of subsection E, which is the current language around early redemption transfers, and which in short says any expenditures made from the cash fund to pay for early redemption of bonds pursuant to blah, 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 then the amount of the reduction will trickle back into the fund. And the reason we struck this, or are proposing to strike this, is that to the points that I launched immediately into about the complexity of calculating debt service in an ongoing way, with layered hypothetical debt service calculations. If this 4% transfer mechanism is adopted, it would effectively capture the intent of this language. Because any amount of early redemption of general obligation bonds will lower the debt service estimate, to your point earlier, Chair Emmons, and then that lowering will increase that delta between A and B for this transfer. So this language strikes us as completely unnecessary if this were to be adopted, and just sort of has the potential to sow administrative confusion. Recommending that be struck.
So I want to go back to C 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I'm looking, this is what was in the appropriations bill, the big budget, as it passed last year. And this is for the uses of the cash fund. And number 3 was costs associated with the early redemption of general obligation bonds. So the early redemption was those callable bonds, I'm assuming, is what C is 3 is referring to.
Probably.
And we wanted to put 20 million towards that. So did the language interpret that the cash fund would be used to pay off some of those callable bonds?
No.
No? Because the 20 million was
The 20
elsewhere.
million was separately appropriated.
So if we go forward to redeem other bonds that could be callable, would come out of the cash fund according to number 3.
It could, or we could appropriate general fund surplus. I mean, if we have to my comments earlier, I'm not anticipating we're going to have endless years of giant surpluses. So there's potential that it could come in.
So I just also want to focus in on the use of the cash fund, where number one talks about for proposed capital projects that occur prior to the construction phase, which you're talking about feasibility, planning, design, engineering, and architectural costs. So if it's engineering and architectural costs, appropriations could pull money out of the cash fund for that piece. Because right now, we're not picking up engineering and agricultural costs in the capital bill anymore. So approps could go to the cash fund to pick up that engineering and architectural costs, correct? Because they're now picking that up in the general fund. And then 2, projects with an anticipated lifespan of 20 years for the cash fund. That's what we do for bonding. We already spoke about 3. And then 4, other eligible capital projects receiving an appropriation from the general fund. How do you interpret that one?
As a catch-all for other capital projects that may not fit into the first buckets. So just other.
Capital projects that could be occurring within the housing sector that maybe we've got a big housing bill? Would it be coming?
If it's a project that would come through this committee, yes. If it's not a project that would come to this committee, no.
So it would be those that are coming through this committee.
That's correct.
So it's a broad interpretation to include what?
To include long-term projects as opposed to projects that can be typically used with general fund monies. Projects that are typical projects that go through this committee.
So I'm confused.
How so?
What projects? Are you talking the whole project cost of something? Because your number 1 is talking about your planning, design, engineering, and architectural costs. And then 4, other eligible capital projects. So what are those other eligible capital projects?
It could be if you're saying, can it pay for more than planning and design? I don't see any reason why not. I mean, that would require the assumption that we're going to have enough money in there to actually pay for all these projects. There may not be enough money in there to pay for design, engineering, and bricks and mortar. So the assumption originally was you remember, last year we were just trying to take out those engineering employees from BGS. Mm-hmm. That was a big deal.
Yeah, and that's upstairs.
Now it seems laughably small,
right.
But that was a big deal. Mm-hmm. So the thought is, well, they should be paid. They shouldn't be paid out of capital. Trying to take, initially our thought was we're going to have, a few million here, a few million there. So we're not going to be able to pay for big buildings. But I don't see anything wrong with saying, well, maybe that would be used for if they have enough money in there. I just don't think they're going to have enough horsepower over a long period of time.
Okay. Questions? Thoughts? Confusion? Clear as mud? John?
I just got to read this more carefully.
Then it'll click.
Well, we will come back to the cash fund. I'm sure we're going to be living it this whole session. Wayne?
I think the intent is really good.
I agree.
The devil's in the details of the language
Yep.
to achieve what you intend to do.
Right.
So the question is, why don't you have a general fund appropriation that just comes out of the general funding? That was the argument last year. Why go through a convolution?
Yeah.
And just pull the cash? That's what was discussed last year. So we'll have to work with our colleagues in appropriations, because that's the other part of our capital budget. Half of our capital budget, almost half, not quite, is really connected to appropriations. And until we know where they are, it's gonna be hard for us to make some movement in some parts for that. Not just with the cash fund, but with the 62 million in cash to begin with. Anything else before we let you guys off the hook and get off the hot seat? Somebody could sit in the hot seat and you were standing.
The commissioner and I will do this presentation at least 3 more times in this building, so we can trade off.
So is this the first time?
This was practice.
This is, yeah.
This is
Next time you can stand on that side and cover us.
Sorry, Gary.
You did well.
Thanks, sir.
So,
It wasn't too bad. You might get easier questions or harder questions elsewhere. I don't know.
we will probably next week on the Senate institutions, they actually asked.
Oh, they'll be easier. They might be easier. Thank you both. We appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you,
gentlemen.
Presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, you too.
Comes this.
So let's go off of, I think we're done for